Good evening, and thank you for joining us for today's edition of This Is My Story. This afternoon we have Scott and Paige Shapley, who are members here at First Baptist Jackson, and they're going to share their story with us today. And so I appreciate so much you tuning in and can't wait to hear their story of how God has been at work in their lives. And so Scott and Paige, thank you so much for joining us today. And so we kind of begin as we do each and every week, and that is, please tell us your story.
Well, I'll go ahead and get started. We do have a story to tell, and I'll tell a little bit about my side of how I grew up and how I came to faith in the Lord.
Great.
When I was 13 years old, my parents, just before that, they divorced. And so I moved to Tennessee when I was about 13 years old, and we moved to Tennessee. And that was the first time I was ever out of the state. The only time I lived out of the state of Mississippi. I've been in Mississippi my whole life since then. Yeah. But I started going to a church there in Tennessee, and when I was 13 years old, during the old hymn, God is Calling the Prodigal, I walked down the aisle, I made my profession of faith, and I knew that's what I needed to do, what I wanted to do. And I was even baptized that same day, in the church. We moved back to Mississippi. I went to high school in Houston, Mississippi, graduated from Houston, Mississippi, and I actually lived about 13 miles outside, and I started going to a little bitty church in Una, Mississippi. Yep. If you ever heard of that.
Sure have. Yeah.
A little bitty church, and a lot of times there weren't enough men to do everything that needed to be done to serve, so they would get me the day of, when nobody showed up.
Yeah.
So I'd pass the plate, I would pray, and they even had me lead singing some. And one Sunday night they even had me preach. That was something else. I was 15 years old, and I think I preached on 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, and I think it lasted maybe 10 minutes, and most of that was me reading the chapter. But
well, that'll get you asked again.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I led singing. I couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, but when I went back years later, I realized that nobody else could either. But we sang from the heart, and it was beautiful. Whenever we heard it, it was beautiful. We sang the old hymns from the hymnal, and that was really good. And I was there every time the doors were open. We lived on a farm. We had plenty to do, but I did break away and get to go to church whenever the doors were open, and I was really glad to that. And looking back, I think in my mind, I thought, my doing good self, going to church all the time self, was kind of earning my way to heaven. And I thought, later on, whenever I kind of slipped away in college, slipped away from the Lord, I remember thinking in my mind that there was the world, and then there was church, and the people beside me weren't sinners, and I left that behind, thinking that I had to make that choice between the world and the church, because I couldn't be a sinner and go to church, and that's kind of my thought process. As I grew up and as I moved on into college.
Yeah, okay. Now, Paige, tell us about you growing up.
Well, I lived in Mississippi all my life, in Jackson. Went to school in Jackson, South Jackson. Been at this church my whole life. Yeah. So I don't know anything different. Yeah. Don't have a great wow, come to Jesus story, just always been in church. Accepted Christ at a Billy Graham crusade here in Jackson, and then was later baptized by Frank Pollard here. We walked the aisle here. My brother and I both ended up walking the Billy Graham crusade, not even sitting together the same night. And so we got baptized together, and that was really neat. So, of course, here my whole life, every time the doors open, just always here. Just grew up in the Lord. But I think, like, the way He's grown me up is, you don't always stay on the right path. You kind of veer off, and, He takes that sandpaper and just kind of refines you And so just had moments like that to grow my faith and just really become stronger in the Lord.
Yeah. You had a good foundation. And
Yes.
it just kind of kept you grounded,
Mm-hmm.
which is awesome.
Yeah.
Now, I know that together life hadn't always been easy. So tell us a little bit about that.
After I left college, I pretty much tried to live life on my own.
Yeah.
I kind of drifted away from the Lord. You know, I spent a lot of time doing that, you know, going by the way of the world. And then I realized that God wasn't through with me yet. He sent me Paige. You know, Paige came into my life.
Yeah.
Oh, she taught me so much. She taught me, you know, how to trust God, how to love, about His mercy and His grace. She taught me how to give first. You know, I never did that before, to give to God first, and she taught me that. And more importantly, she taught me, you know, how important it was, and she modeled for me how important it was for that personal relationship with God the Father. And she taught me that. And when we got married, you know, we had our oldest daughter, Emma, who's 24 now. And, you know, life was good. We got involved in the church here at First Baptist. We got involved. God was good. Everything was good, and things were going along good, I thought.
Yeah. We went to Sunday school in this very room right here under some great leadership.
Yeah.
And just God's people. I mean, I feel like First Jackson is my home base.
Yeah.
Just the people. I know people look at it and say, what a big church. But when you get inside, it's really not. And I've been loved on so richly, we all have, through the people in this church.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just been really a neat process.
Neat.
We were married for about 7 years. And then I think Paige, looking back, she kind of said it best. She said, the enemy found a kink in our armor and
Wreaked havoc.
And pounced on us. We got too comfortable. He found that kink in it, and we got too comfortable. And it happened that we split apart. Our family was ripped apart. The separation and the divorce was about a total of 4 years, you know, that we were apart. We were apart for that long. It was when Emma was maybe 5 years old when all this. So I found myself, you know, on my own. You know, I never lived on my own by myself. I always lived with someone. I was all alone, and I found myself that way. And you know, I think during that time, I never abandoned God. I never forgot God, but I never would commit to God, if that makes sense.
Yep.
You know, during that time when I was all alone, I felt I had nobody. You know, I even read the Bible through twice. You know, during those 4 years. You know, just looking for something. But at the same time, I never would leave the world. You know, I was being numbed by the world. You know, that being something to get rid of the pain. And I think during that time, God taught me several things during that time. You know, He taught me that God was not first priority in my life. An important thing was that I was not the spiritual leader of my family. And I don't think that's old school or counterculture or anything. I think God, you know, I know that God, that's what God wants us to do. And I think, you know, looking back, it was a problem in our family on what we did, you know, because I didn't step up to the plate. You know, Paige, she was our spiritual leader, and that doesn't always work. You know, the man's got to step up, and I realized that I didn't. And the other thing that he taught me was that, you know, I just kept letting the world influence me. And you know, and then also during that time, you know, I'm a firm believer in God uses a lot defining moments in life circumstances to bring us back to Him, because I never would really let go and just let Him take over my life. And He brought several things into my life, and I'd like to share some of them if that's okay.
Of course, absolutely.
First off was, you know, I was divorce is hard. You know, it's hard financially, it's hard spiritually, it's hard on the kids, everything. And like I said, I found myself alone. And this kind of dates me, but this was back during 9/11. You know, this was 9/11, and when that happened, I never felt more alone than then, you know, because what was going on in the world. And I was sitting in my house, I was hungry, I was cold. I rented a house in Clinton, and I was sitting out the window just looking, and then I realized the ice was on the inside, not the outside. So it was just a cold, cold winter, but somehow God brought me through that winter, you know, and he taught me that, you know, through that I could appreciate all the things that I have in my life. You know, I have an appreciation for things. I think that carried over even into last year when I lost my job for 8 months. I didn't have a worry in the world then because God led me through that before, because God provided, and I think that helped me, you know, in that circumstance. Yeah. And the other thing that God did, and I didn't realize at the time, but being alone, I got to spend time with my mom. And she got sick with cancer during that time. But in her final days, I got to spend, you know, several weeks, a lot of time with her. And I realized from her how much she loved the Lord. And I realized the kind of person she was. The last night before she died in the hospital, she was hooked up to a ventilator. And we were sitting around, and my stepdad, he was actually sitting in the corner, and he said he was cold. And so Mama scribbled a note and handed it to me. And I opened up the note. She said, there's one of my sweaters in the car, go get it for him. So, you know, she was always thinking of other people. You know, she was always thinking of other people. And God taught me, you know, the legacy you live, you know, matters. It matters to God, and it matters, you know, how you live on this earth. Now, the other thing was that is really mainly Paige's testimony, but it also had an influence on my life, and it was a defining moment. Was one July night, I got a call, and Paige and Emma's apartment had caught on fire, and I'm sure she'll tell you more about that on how the Lord worked through that. But the sad part about that is I wasn't there to help and protect my family. You know, I was just missing, and you know, God taught me that I need to stand up and be a man and do that. Finally, later that same summer, I finally hit my rock bottom. You know, I was numbing myself from the pain. I wasn't, like I said, I didn't forget God, but I wasn't turning my life, you know, over to God. So, and I knew my life was a wreck. And one morning, something I never had done before, I just fell flat on the floor on my knees beside my bed. And I pleaded and I begged with God. I said, please, God, save me. Help me get over these demons that have so possessed my life. I said, please help me. And that day, he did. You know, I mean, he saved me. That, to me, that's the date. That's the date there on the floor that I got saved, and God, you know, brought this prodigal son, you know, back home.
Wow, wow. So you said that the divorce process took a matter of time. I mean, that was several years.
Yeah, we were separated for a year, and then actually divorced for 3 years.
Yeah.
So
what was that like for you?
Well, it felt like as soon as the ink was dry on the paper, God got busy with me. Emma and I were living alone. I would take her to school. I was working from home, so I'd take her to school, and then I'd come home and have my quiet time before I started work.
Right.
And it literally felt like he was sitting on the couch beside me, talking to me. I didn't hear an audible voice, but it was that clear to me. And he said, this is not what I want for your family. I want y'all together. You're a family. I made this family, and I want you together.
This was after you signed the papers. This is not
it
a
was
separation
official.
period.
No,
it was a done deal.
It was over,
Wow.
which I promptly told God in case he missed that memo, you know. Did you forget? You know, we're divorced. What are you talking about?
Right.
So I argued with him a little bit, you know, you know, and I would bring up things like, well, he said this, you know, and did you forget this happened? And he brought me to Philippians 3:13, you know, forget what's behind, strive for what's ahead. go for the goal. And the goal is him. And he's like, just trust me. Just trust me. And it was so clear to me that I did. So during those next 3 years, I approached Scott. I got up the nerve. It took every ounce of courage I had. And I would go to Scott and tell him what God had revealed to me. And I wish I had a picture of the look on his face the first time I said it.
I bet.
So it didn't go well. And so I thought, well, that's okay. It surprised him, And so after that, when God would prompt me, I would, get my prayer warriors busy, work up my courage, and I would go talk to Scott again. But every time, he was just like, you're crazy. And it just felt like a sucker punch to the gut every time. And I would get frustrated because I'm like, I thought, well, I'm doing what God says. It's supposed to work out. But, all parties have to be willing. So I just kept following and listening to God, and kept going back when he would tell me. And then eventually I went back to work outside the home. And so that was a huge adjustment. But became really good friends with the girl I worked next to, and she was a strong Christian. She had been through a lot, and so we became really, really close. And so that summer of the fire, I had gotten so discouraged and so I had just lost hope in the human race. I just was so tired and so done. And then lightning struck our building. Whole 16 units burned down as we stood there and just watched like a bonfire. There was nothing we could do. But then there's so many incredible stories of just, I'm such a firm believer. I mean, God loves us so specifically, and he shows us that. And I think it's so cool just because of the few things that, our whole place was destroyed. If it wasn't burned, it was ruined by water, or we lived on the bottom floor. The roof caved in on our stuff. So most everything was lost, but there's a handful of things that we saved. In my bedroom, the roof caved in and everything was soaked. My Bible was laying on the nightstand right beside my bed. Not a drop of water was on it. I still carry it to this day.
Wow.
It didn't even smell of smoke, because that was the other thing that destroyed the rest of it, was the smell.
Yeah.
And then Emma was young. She had not made her profession of faith at that time, but she had grown up here. So she had a little bear that my nephew had given her, and she slept with it every night. And she had spent the night away from home the night before, so it was in her sleepover bag, but it was in her room, and it was untouched. And that bear did not smell like smoke, which is so incredible. Yes. And then one other thing was a desk that I had repainted for her, and you could literally see the ring of water. Water came all the way up to that desk, and it was dry under that desk. So those were about the three things we got out.
Wow.
And then as people here found out, so many people just were the hands and feet of Jesus. It was just incredible, the stories. And it just renewed my faith in people and in God, because, he literally provided. It was hard enough being a single mom, making things work.
Yeah.
Now everything's gone, you're starting over. My dad had gone and gotten renter's insurance. I had no idea. I wouldn't have even thought of that. And so, that was a blessing that came out of it. Just really neat stories like that. Just so many, that would be a whole nother day.
Sure.
But we're standing there watching it burn down, and I can't get a hold of Scott because I didn't want him to see it on the news, because, of course, the news crews were there. Finally got a hold of him, and he knew. But as I'm walking through that, because that's starting all over, and it was so hard anyway, being a single mom, and now you're just starting over from nothing, basically. Just became really frustrated. And so during all this too, I'm going to him as God's telling me, because our family's supposed to be together. And so I really, really got tired, just weary, because I was trying to, say the right things, do the right things to make this work how God was telling me He wanted it to work. And so I was just weary. And I got to work one day, and I started sobbing at work. And my friend heard me, and she's like, "Are you okay?" I said, "No." And this was so powerful to me. She just came, we had cubicles, so we're just out open. She came over to me. She said, "Is it the fire or Scott?" I said, "Both. I'm just so tired." And she laid her hands on my shoulders, and she prayed over me right that minute. And I literally could feel the weight lifting off of me. And at that point was when I let Scott go so God could deal with him, because it wasn't my job. I was supposed to do me. And, I was trying to fix him too in all this, and make him see the right way in all this. And so I just let go. I'm like, "You're going to have to take it. I can't do this anymore." I remember, I think it was that night too, I shook my fist at God because I was so angry. I was like, "I'm doing everything you're telling me to do, and this is not working out the way you're telling me it's going to. I can't do this anymore." And again, I could almost audibly hear Him say to me, "Finally, thank you. I'll take it. I've got this." And that very night was when He hit his rock bottom and the ball started rolling.
Wow.
God had it in motion.
All right, I got to stop you here, because there's some things that I want to ask about and kind of point out. I mean, I hear you tell your story, and to hear you talk about how the ink is dried on the divorce papers. So legally, the marriage is over. However, God is telling you it doesn't need to be over. And you're going to Him and telling Him what God is revealing to you. That's incredible, because I imagine that there had to have been some people in your life who were going, "Paige, you're crazy. I mean, y'all are divorced. You've been through this for a long time. Things haven't been good for several years. You've got to be wrong." So there had to have been some people who were kind of telling you that, right?
Right, because divorce was the easy fix,
Yeah.
Just end that and it'll be okay. And I tell people all the time, it feels good for a minute, and then you got a whole new set of problems.
Absolutely.
Because it doesn't affect just you. It affects a lot of people.
But at the same time, I hear you saying that particularly the church, Christian friends, were praying for you and encouraging you.
Absolutely.
So you were hearing kind of different messages.
Yes.
There were some who probably were saying, "Paige, you're crazy. You don't need to be getting back with Scott." But then there were some who were affirming what God was doing in your life and continuing to pray for you and encourage you in being obedient to what God wanted you to do.
Right.
And you did it. That's an incredible story. It's one thing to say that we know God, but trusting Him in difficult times, and when He asks us to do difficult things, that's tough.
What I have found in that is it's hard, but it's easier to let Him handle things. He does it so much better.
That's a great point. And then I hear you say, well, for one, we see, kind of as we talked about last week, God's hand, God's sovereignty, and even through difficult things like the fire, the Bible, the stuffed animal, the desk. I mean, those things where you're able to look and say, "Okay, God was with me." And sometimes, honestly, it's easier to see that when you're telling the story than it is when you're living it.
Right.
I mean, there's no question about
Right.
that. And that's the great thing about telling stories, is it helps us to kind of hear somebody else's story and maybe look at what God's doing in our lives. But I also hear you talk about what had to have been maybe the most difficult thing, and that is turning Scott over to God, knowing that you couldn't fix it.
Right.
That if the only way it was going to be fixed is if God did it.
Right.
But He did.
Yes.
So tell me what that was like for you. I mean, of course, you don't know probably at the time when she's praying and saying, God, I'm done. I turned him over to you. But there was a turning point in your life at that point.
Oh, yeah. Because I realized that through this whole time, Paige was always there for me. She prayed for me continuously. She went to God on my behalf, for things that I've done,
yeah.
and I realized that, and I thought about that would make a good book. Do you realize the power of a ex-wife, of a praying ex-wife?
That's right. Wow.
Because her prayers helped to bring me back.
And I knew it was working because he called me one night. Exactly what are you praying? So I knew God was doing something.
Wow. Wow. Mm-hmm. So you knew God was chasing you. You just maybe didn't like it, but you knew it was happening.
Yeah. And I just didn't accept it, at the time.
Wow. So at what point did things start coming back together?
After that day, we started having conversation. 3 months later, we got remarried.
Wow.
In her apartment, her new apartment that she moved to, and Emma was our flower girl and our ring bearer.
Maid of honor, best man, ring bearer, and she played keyboard.
Yeah. So it was 3 months after that.
Wow.
That we the conversation was started. God had brought us back together.
Unbelievable.
So
wow. And you've been married now
16,
November,
almost 16 in November. It'll be 16 years.
Wow.
Now that's a lot of different anniversary dates to remember. Sometimes I get confused.
Right. Well, they're all important, though.
That's right.
Well, what an incredible story of perseverance, an incredible story of restoration, an incredible story of God pursuing us when we're running away from Him. I mean, it's just, God is all over your story, and that's an incredible, incredible thing. And so we're almost out of time, but I want to ask you a question because I think people are going to be watching this and they're going to identify with your story. And so for a couple who's going through a tough time, for a wife who's wondering, what else can I do? For a man who's maybe regretting some decisions or maybe kind of, at the end of his rope relationally, what would be your advice to a couple who's going through what you have been through?
Well, I know when we got back together, I know when you get married, nobody thinks divorce is down the road.
Right.
But it's offered as such a quick fix these days, I think. And so when we got remarried, we verbally said, divorce is not an option. It's not on the table at all, no matter what. So my advice is just, don't take the easy way out and pray.
Yeah.
Because God is powerful.
Yeah.
And confirmation for me, Chip, was when she was going to this Sunday school, and when I came in and started going with her, I know that they were there for her during the fire. They were there for her, and I suspect they had been praying for me a long time too.
Yeah.
But they accepted me, just like I was one of their own in this Sunday school and this church. We got plugged in to that, and that was just confirmation that it's where I should have been all along, So that was confirmation from me. So never give up, trust God, and don't wait for Him to knock you upside the head. Just do it when you hear it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, great. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It really is incredible. And so we want to thank you for joining us this evening and for being so faithful each and every week to hear these stories. And tonight again, you've heard a pattern over the last several weeks of the sovereignty of God. God is always there. He is always at work. Sometimes we don't see how He's at work, but He is at work. And through their story tonight, you've also been able to hear a couple of really important things, I think. And one is that sin is sometimes the easier way, but it's not the best way. God's way is always the best way. And sometimes we can be tempted to kind of give up, and sometimes just tempted to not take God at His word. But hang in there, because blessings are oftentimes just right around the corner from when we're kind of at the end of our rope. And so you've also been able to hear tonight that there are people in your corner. And I think that's what Scott learned, is that, as he came back to church, there are people who've been praying for him that he didn't even know about. And so sometimes we think we're alone, but we're not alone. There are people who have your back. There are people who are there who are willing to help you. And I want you to know First Baptist Jackson is here to help you. And any way we can ever be of help, please let us know. Thank you again for joining us for this edition of This Is My Story. Hope that you'll join us again next week. Hope you have a great week this week.